to all of you, especially to the newest students of Globet, of which is already cohort number 8. So before giving you the way to the inaugural conference of this academic year by Professor Kalwant Bhopal from University of Birmingham, I would like to introduce myself and welcome you formally. So I am Anthony Berger, one of the lecturers and directors of Globet together with Xavier Bonal. It's a great pleasure and with great enthusiasm that we welcome you to our masters. We are thrilled to have you joining us on this academic journey, and we anticipate an enriching experience ahead. So all of us, students, lecturers, colleagues, are here because we believe in education as a powerful catalyst of transformation, positive change. So in today's world, the intersection of education policy, international development is more critical than ever. And the Globet program has been meticulously designed to equip you with the knowledge, skills, and perspectives that are needed to address these complex educational policy challenges that we face ahead. So, nonetheless, Globet does not only will equip you with the necessary theoretical and methodological skills to excel in rigorous policy analysis and implementation. Globet is especially designed to make the case of education policy making being a matter of societal values, among which social justice, democracy, and equity stand out. So our ultimate goal is that our students develop professional work that is both technically scrupulous and socially meaningful. So Globet is unique in combining academic knowledge, technical expertise, and societal sensitivity in a program that aims at providing the educational for development field with thoughtful, sensitive, and creative professionals. So as you embark on this educational voyage, you will have the opportunity to engage with leading experts, to collaborate with peers from very diverse backgrounds, and explore a wide range of issues that are related to education policy and international development. So through your time here, you will be encouraged to think critically, to question assumptions, to explore innovative solutions to the educational disparities and global development issues that our world faces. You will also have access to valuable resources, research opportunities, and a supportive academic community that will nurture your intellectual growth. So we encourage you to be curious, compassionate, and committed to making a positive impact on the field of education policy, in the years to come. And what a better way than today's conference to demonstrate this commitment of our program. The conference, to be given by Professor Bhopal, is titled Black and Minority Ethnic Experiences in Higher Education, and will be duly introduced by my colleague and director of the JEP Center, Aina Tarabini. So once again, welcome to Globet, and the floor is yours, Aina.
Thank you very much, Tony. Very briefly, also, as he said, it's a pleasure, and we are very excited to have all you here. I will be lecturing basic research methods with you starting next week. And it's a big pleasure to have Professor Bhopal with us today. Just shortly, because I want her to explain all the things she has to share with us. She is professor, as Tony said, of Education and Social Justice in the University of Birmingham, and she's also director of the Center for Research in Race and Education. And her research is amazing, trust me. You have to read her articles, her books. Basically, she focuses on the experiences, on the lives of Black minority students in education, in higher education. So she will share with us lots of insightful elements connected with identity, with marginalization, with intersectionality, and also with a lens of social justice and inclusion. So thank you very much, Kalwant, for being with us, even if it's online. The floor is yours, and thank you for making this lecture for our students and colleagues.
Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you to Aina, Antonio, and Leah for inviting me today. It's an absolute honor for me to be here, even though it is online. So I just want to share my screen, Leah. Is that okay? Shall I go ahead and share it? Okay, so can you see that?
Yes, Kalwant.
Okay, good. Let me just put the slideshow on. Can you see that? Excellent, brilliant. Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me to giving me the opportunity to share my work today. So what I want to do is I want to talk about Black and minority ethnic experiences in higher education with a specific focus on social justice, inclusion, and white privilege. So I am talking about this within the UK context, so forgive me that I'm not focusing entirely on Europe. So in the UK, that we've had lots of focus in terms of policy making around social justice and inclusion. We've had the widening participation agenda, which was introduced by the new Labour government back in 1999. The widening participation agenda is hugely important because it gave the opportunity for students from marginalised and poor communities to enter higher education. In 2000, we had the Race Relations Amendment Act. The Race Relations Amendment Act is important because it provided us with a definition of institutional racism. And in 2010, we had the Equality Act, which brought together all the acts into one single act. And it's important because it includes protected characteristics of which race is one. We've also had policy initiatives in higher education, such as, for example, the Athena Swan Charter, which works to progress the position of women in science, technology, engineering, and maths. And more recently, we've had the Race Equality Charter, which specifically focuses on race. However, despite these significant advances in policymaking, with the Conservative government, we had the Commission for Racial and Ethnic Disparities, which was set up after the tragic murder of George Floyd and the global eruption of the Black Lives Matter protests. However, they published a Sewell report in 2021, and they argued that they found no evidence of institutional racism. So one of the things that I want you to think about is that I argue that race is only addressed during particular historical moments in society. So race was addressed when Stephen Lawrence was murdered. So we had the Race Relations Amendment Act. Race is addressed when George Floyd is murdered. And it also is dependent on the political climate at that time. So at the moment, we have the rise of the far right in Europe. And indeed, I would argue that the Conservatives themselves are an example of far rightness. So what happens is the discourse and narrative around race significantly changed. However, I argue in my work, despite significant advances in policy making, gender has always been given precedence over race. The main beneficiaries of Athena Swan have been white women. Now, we know that there's been an increase in the numbers of Black and minority ethnic students attending higher education institutions in the UK. And I know that the term BME is hugely problematic, and there's different terminology that we use. So there's people of colour, there's marginalised communities, there's ethnic minority communities. Whatever term we use, it's important to problematize it and to talk about the complexity of the term, but to always understand that there are differences within and between the BME category. So the BME category is not homogenous. So it's really important to understand that. So in the UK, white students are more likely to leave university with a first class or a 2-1 degree compared to BME students as a whole. However, it's higher proportions of Chinese, Indian, and mixed heritage students who are more likely to receive this first. But Black students and Pakistani and Bangladeshi students remain the most disadvantaged. And there's BME attainment or an awarding gap of 10.8 percentage points, with Black students being the most disadvantaged and Chinese and Indian students being the most advantaged. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of looking at the individual groups within that category. So let's talk about inequality, inequality, inequality. So Black and minority ethnic students do achieve good A-level grades. A-levels are the exams that you take in the UK before you enter university. And those exams are very, very important because those grades that you get determine the type of university that you go to. And when BME students do achieve good A-level grades, they are less likely to be able to apply to good universities, like, for example, Oxbridge or the Russell Group. The Russell Group is a group of 24 institutions in the UK that are research-led, and they have excellence in research and teaching, etc. And when Black and minority ethnic students do apply to these universities, they are less likely to be offered a place compared to white students with comparable A-level results. And in my work, I argue that this is a system of educational apartheid. David Lammy argues it's a system of social apartheid. So furthermore, Black and minority ethnic students are underrepresented in prestigious elite universities. And it's Black students who are the most disadvantaged. They are more likely to drop out of university, citing an ethnocentric curriculum and racism from their peers and their lecturers. I think sometimes it's really important to think about those trajectories and those journeys of higher education. So in some sense, I argue that when students come to us at higher education, it's almost too late because in some ways those foundations have already been made. So we need to step back and look at those journeys of education. So for example, in the UK, we have 6.5% of school children attend independent fee-paying private schools, compared to 93% who attend state schools. 55% of students who go to private schools go on to a Russell Group university, including 6% who go on to study at Oxford or indeed Cambridge. So I argue that advantage is awarded to those who are already in an advantageous position. Once privileged, always privileged. This is based on class, wealth, and indeed ethnicity. Processes of exclusion, I argue, are based on whiteness and white privilege, which is access to social, cultural, and economic capital. And as somebody who feels that social justice is hugely important in educational trajectories, I believe that education is a right. But instead, what has happened is education has indeed become a privilege. Let me show you how. So if we look at those transitions from undergraduate to postgraduate study, we see that Black and minority ethnic students do have higher rates of transition to master's degrees, but it's white students who have continued to have greater access to postgraduate research, such as PhDs. This, we argue in our research, is based on access to financial and economic capital, which affects transitions to postgraduate study. And we know that the decisions that students make in the final year of their undergraduate study has a huge impact on social mobility, access to the labour market, and future life chances. And furthermore, what happens is that BME students incur an ethnic penalty within the labour market. So once they enter the labour market, those inequalities do not stop. They are more likely to be unemployed 6 months after they graduate compared to white groups. And we know that there's a huge BME ethnic pay gap within higher education, and BME employees face a 3.2 billion annual pay penalty within the labour market. So let's look at the staff demographics, because I think it's really important to understand that transition. I keep talking about that transitional journey after PhD and then into higher education. So the statistics tell us around 11% of staff identify as BME, and we know that there's been a year-on-year increase over the last 10 years in terms of the numbers of staff who enter higher education. However, amongst UK academic staff, we have only 5.2% of BME staff who are heads of institutions. So out of 154 universities in the UK, we only have 6 vice chancellors or presidents. And professors are more likely to be white. Almost 91% of professors are white compared to very small numbers. And I'm going to show you a table to demonstrate this. And furthermore, a larger proportion of white staff are more likely to be on the highest pay spine of earning almost £63,000 a year or more compared to BME staff when they are doing the same job. So I thought it would be interesting for you to see this table of the recent statistics. So there's almost 14,500 white professors. So this is the UK professoriate in 2022. The total of BME is 1,490. And if you break that number down, because as I said, it's important to look at the differences within that category, there are only 100 Black professors in the whole of the UK, of which only 26 are women. So I think it's really important to talk about intersectional experiences, because when I give lectures around race, I'm always accused of not looking at intersectionality, which is quite interesting, because if you've read my work, you probably can see that intersectionality features quite heavily in the ways in which I understand the discourses around whiteness. And I argue that what's happened this term used by generally white, woke, liberal feminists who claim to understand the racial experiences of marginalized women. And let's go back and look at the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw argues that the reason why intersectionality is important is because of its focus on the intersections of race and gender, which only highlights the need to account for multiple grounds of identity when considering how the social world is constructed. So intersectionality is important, not just in understanding higher education experiences, but in understanding all the experiences of marginalized women. And from a critical race theory, focus on the most privileged group members marginalizes those who are multiply burdened and obscures claims that cannot be understood as resulting from discrete sources of discrimination. Furthermore, Antheus Yuval Davis argues that intersectionality is the most comprehensive, complex, and indeed nuanced concept. It does not reduce social hierarchical relations of power into one axle of power, whether it is class, race, or gender. And in my work, I argue that what's happened is in recent times, white privilege and hierarchy of oppression has resulted in a discourse of denial in which gender as a competing identity has always been given greater significance and prominence compared to race. So an intersectional approach is hugely crucial in this day and age. So why do we have these inequalities in universities? Because universities are meant to be liberal, progressive. They have social justice at the heart of their agendas. And as Antonio said in his introduction, that this is one of the things that is important in your course, but also important in understanding why we work in universities and why students come to universities. However, not so. Processes of racism, exclusion, and overt marginalization continue to exist in higher education for students and staff. Processes of conscious and unconscious bias continue to persist, with expectations from BME staff and indeed students based upon racial profiling and stereotypes of BME students continue to persist. And this takes place within overt and covert processes of racism and indeed microaggressions, and particularly for staff around career promotion and career progression. So I want to talk a little bit about the concept of white privilege and how I use it. I draw on the work of Peggy McIntosh, who argues that white privilege is an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions that white people carry around with them. This includes maps, passports, code books, visas, etc., etc. White privilege means you can walk through customs without being stopped. White privilege means that you are less likely to be stopped and searched by the police. White privilege means you can use a restroom without being arrested. White privilege means in America you can shoot someone and leave the courtroom a free man. Derek Bell argues that racist hierarchical structures govern all political, economic and social domains. Such structures, he argues, allocate the privileging of whites in all arenas, including the so-called liberal field of education. In my work, I argue that there are different shades of whiteness and white privilege. There's acceptable and unacceptable, legitimate and illegitimate forms of whiteness. So, for example, gypsy and traveller groups who identify as white do not hold the same privileges afforded to white middle-class groups. So the discourse and narrative around whiteness different ways and in different spaces. So who benefits from white policy making? So in my work, I argue, yes, of course, universities will advance policy making, which works to further or it is in terms of being performative, further the interests of Black and minority ethnic groups. But this is for their own self-interest. It's a performative exercise. And Derek Bell argues, yes, of course, whites will advance the causes of racial justice, but only when doing so coincides with their own self-interest. And David Gilbourne argues the continued promotion of policies and practices that are known to be racially divisive testifies to a tacit intentionality in the system, a tacit intentionality in the system. So it's no accident that Black students are less likely to leave university with a 2-1 or a first. It's no accident that Black students are more likely to be unemployed 6 months after they graduate. And it's no accident that Black students are more likely to drop out of university. And Gloria Ladson-Billings argues that whites are the main beneficiaries of educational policy making, even though they are designed to serve the marginalised. So white women have been the main beneficiaries of the Athena Swan Charter in the UK, and white women have been the main beneficiaries of affirmative action in the US. And I argue, as long as white identity and white privilege are not threatened, of course white groups are supportive of EDI programmes such as affirmative action and the Race Equality Charter in the UK. Consequently, I argue they can sell themselves as diverse and fair as long as their white privilege remains intact and unthreatened. So when I talk about exclusion and racism, I think it's really important to understand space and how that works, because I argue that the way that we understand white space is really important in terms of geographical location and the ways in which those discourses and narratives play out around racism and exclusion. And Kobayashi and Peake argue, yes, of course we know that whiteness is a normative identity within which power and privilege are translated by controlling dominant values and institutions, and in particular by occupying space within a segregated landscape. So the segregated landscape is hugely important. And Hartkin argues that, yes, the meaning of race varies from location to location, but it also depends on the set of concerns against which it is prioritized, and indeed other forms of consciousness or modes of reading within which it is ranked and arranged. And I argue that universities are key spaces in which whiteness and white identities predominate, not just in the representation of white groups occupying senior decision-making roles, and I've just shown you the data on that, but I argue that this is also evidence within the white curriculum, the Eurocentric curriculum, and indeed approaches to EDI and social justice. So in higher education, within the umbrella of education, diversity and inclusion, EDI and social justice, we have all these different identities that need to be addressed, but race always takes a backseat. It's always about gender, it's always about class, it's always about disability. Race never gets a priority, only within particular historical moments. So what I hope I've done is I've given you some data and statistics, I've given you a little bit of theory, and now I'm going to show you and talk about a study that supports everything that I've just said. So I carried out this research in 2016, and then I also carried out some more interviews for my book, White Privilege. I was particularly interested in exploring the experiences of academics, in how they were positioned in higher education. I wanted to talk about the existence of support networks and career progression, and also to investigate their experiences of exclusion and marginalization. And because I knew that I was going to talk to master's students today, I've included some slides on methodology. And I think it's important for you to look at these study aims and to recognise that I did not use the word racism. So when I interviewed my respondents, I didn't want to use the word racism. Even though it wasn't a discursive analysis, I thought it was important for students, for individuals to give voice to their concerns, because I felt if I used the word racism, then that would actually lead them in terms of talking about it. So when I went back and analysed my interviews, and racism, the word racism was mentioned over 200 times in terms of analysing the data. So I conducted 65 in-depth semi-structured interviews. I was particularly interested in making a comparison between the UK and the USA. And I must say, as a footnote, this was pre-Trump and pre-Brexit. And I think if the research took place after that, I think the findings may well have been different. Face-to-face telephone and Skype interviews were conducted. Respondents filled out a consent form. They were given the opportunity to read their transcripts and change them. None said that they wanted to. But what was particularly interesting about the study was many of the respondents saw the interview as a therapeutic process. It gave voice to their experiences, particularly when they spoke about racism, because they said they were never asked about these experiences. And in effect, many of them said that their universities didn't even recognize that racism existed in their own institutions. The interviews were tape recorded and the data was transcribed. I used grounded theory to analyze my research. This was based on coding and developing themes. And I wanted to make sense of the language that was used by the respondents. And as I said, not mentioning the word racism was really important. But even though it wasn't a discourse analysis, the language was really important to me, because that's something that I think is really interesting, particularly in describing these research. My identity and positionality within the research was very important, particularly in relation to my own positioning as a working class woman from an Indian background. Respondents asked me about my own personal experience, and the more I revealed, the more open they were. And I argued that within research, that the notion of power and reflexivity is hugely important. And as researchers, we must be reflective in terms of how we conduct the research. And I argue that power itself is based on a continuum. So in some sense, so power is static. Power is not static, sorry, it's dynamic. It changes within the interview process. So on the one hand, respondents had the power because they could withhold information or tell me what they felt I wanted to hear. In other instances, I had the power because I held the clipboard, I could direct the questions, and I asked the questions. And a Black feminist researcher, my own position and my own ethnic identity is hugely important in terms of understanding the racial experiences that my respondents spoke about. So BME academics were positioned as outsiders, insiders. They felt they were not accepted within the white space. What was particularly interesting about Black women respondents, they talked about their presentation of self, and they said that the way they spoke and what they wore and the language that they used was related to their notion of how credible they were seen, not just by their colleagues, but also by students. And this was also seen in the ways in which they presented themselves. And Irving Goffman writes beautifully about the presentation of self. And in the book, my book 2016, where this research is presented, there's a chapter on there about methodology and how the presentation of self and Irving Goffman's work is hugely important. And I have some quotes here to demonstrate that. As a Black woman, I am aware of how I show myself to the world, how I dress, what I say, and how I say it. I know I'll be judged by all of these things, and I have to make sure that I'm professional all of the time. But I know that this isn't always the case for my white colleagues. As a female of colour, I have to ensure that I am representing other females of colour, and that means being credible, being professional, and being seen this way. Support networks were hugely important for the respondents. They received different types of support: emotional, academic, instrumental, from their colleagues and their peers. It existed inside and outside the academy. It was based upon academic input and also successful career trajectories. But what was really important about support networks was that BME academics felt they did not have access to what I call a network of knowns. And the network of knowns is gatekeepers who hold the keys in terms of what you have to do to be promoted. And many of the respondents felt they did not have this access because it was predominated by white men and white women. So in this process of thinking about promotion, they themselves felt excluded. So the most important type of support I have had, said one respondent, is having access to a couple of experienced professors who've read my portfolio for my full professorship. They've been through the process and they can help me improve on what I need to do. And that is vital. And I work in an environment that is predominantly white. And as a female and woman of colour, I need to find support networks to understand that I am a woman of colour who will not be seen or indeed not be positioned as a white woman or a white man. And mentoring was hugely important, particularly in relation to understanding the processes that were needed for promotion. So in the UK, and I don't know what the situation is in Spain, universities do not have to, they're not obliged to have a formal mentoring system in place. So there's formal mentoring in some universities, which is very good and also very bad, but there's also informal mentoring, which individuals themselves work to develop, particularly in relation to networks. The timing of mentoring was considered to be important, but respondents themselves, they wanted to be mentored, but they also wanted to mentor more junior colleagues because they saw it as something that was giving back to their own communities, because they themselves felt as though they hadn't benefited from these things. We have several mentoring programs here, and they've been really good. I was given a mentor who's in the same faculty as me, who understood some of the issues, and also my research area. And that worked in a great way for me. My mentor was from a different faculty. I don't think that would work. There needs to be some common understanding. I wanted to ensure that when I mentored, I could understand and empathise. For many women of colour, their experiences are very different because they are disadvantaged. So it's better to have someone who can understand this. So what was really interesting about the career promotion and progression was that many of the respondents felt that they came to a point just before Professor where their career hit the buffers. Promotion was limited and it was seen as an illusion. And they felt as though there was a lack of transparency in what was required to become a professor. So this was a nebulous criteria. So even though there were criteria, they felt as though they were judged more harshly and the criteria changed. So it wasn't just a process of surveillance. They felt it was a process of hyper surveillance. So they had to have published more. They had to have served on more committees. They had to have brought more money in compared to their white colleagues. And some of the respondents, though not all of them, were. They did this kind of work. It was seen as deficit. It's not real research. It's something you're interested in because you are a person of colour. And there was also a recognition of research and publications outside the Anglo-American world. So if they were conducting research in the African continent or the Indian subcontinent, this research was not valued as significant as research in the so-called first world. You kind of get to a certain point in your career when you really want to progress. And it's kind of like your career hits a brick wall and you don't know what to do. For us as people of colour, it's much harder. It's that additional thing of, will I be accepted by my peers as an equal? If you are conducting or writing about racial injustice or other types of inequalities and you are Black, it's not seen as real research. It's seen as personal and not judged as being objective. And that makes it harder to get further on in your career if your research is not valued. So yes, respondents did talk about racism, both covert and overt, from their colleagues and from students. They talked about the lack of BME representation in senior decision-making roles, and which they said reinforced their position as other. It was based on their acceptance and credibilities. And when they did complain about racism, this was dismissed as a simple clash of personalities. It's not racism, you don't get on with this person. It's got nothing to do with this racism. So there was a discourse of denial of the refusal to understand that racism and racist practices actually exist within universities. It's subtle, it's not overt, so you can't see it or prove it. You can't bring it out or challenge it. It's not tangible, So how do I challenge that? It makes it harder when you feel it's racism, but you can't prove it. They see me as a Black female and they judge me based on that. They judge me based on a stereotype, and all they've used then go back to that stereotype. So you find yourself always having to ensure that you are reacting to that stereotype because you don't want to be defined by it. And one respondent said, I am constantly aware of being an outsider. So where are we now? Are these new racisms in 2023, or are they just old racisms? So I chose these quotes because of their dates and also because they're very good in terms of what I'm trying to, my argument today. So the first quote was 23 years ago by Bonilla, Silva and Foreman. And they said, a new race talk has emerged in the reproduction of white supremacy. It allows whites to appear not racist, to preserve their privileged status, to blame blacks for their lower status and criticize any institutional approach, such as affirmative action, that attempts to ameliorate racial inequality. And in 2011, we said, to argue that post-Macpherson, and this was just after the tragedy of Stephen Lawrence, who was murdered because he was Black, and then the Macpherson report changed the policy making to introduce a definition of institutional racism. To argue that post-Macpherson has resulted in a post-racial society is utterly absurd. Such discourses serve only to further disadvantage and marginalize Black and minority ethnic communities. Racism, we argued, exists at every level of society. It permeates our schools, our colleges, and indeed our universities. It is alive in all elements of society, our popular culture, our media, and the social spaces that we occupy. And in 2018, I argued, higher education institutions are spaces of white privilege, which fail to cater for the experiences of BME groups. They employ a rhetoric of inclusion, but one that is rarely evident in practice or outcomes. I put it to you that these are not new racisms. This is racism, which is business as usual. And finally, where do we go from here? So I wanted to end on a positive note. So of course, intersectional experiences are hugely important. We must look at race, class, and gender. Universities must provide good qualitative and quantitative data to develop good practice. We need a greater visibility of staff in academic and senior decision-making roles. So I argue we should have a target system for the number of BME staff in senior roles, not a quota system, because quota systems are illegal here in the UK. They do exist in the US and they're legal there. We need processes of training, whether it is mentoring or for promotion. Mandatory unconscious bias training, if done well, can work. Universities must provide clear plans on how they have addressed racism. So we need a target system from the number of students attending Russell Group universities. We must link the Race Equality Charter mark to funding. The Athena Swan Charter has been linked to funding. So the Race Equality Charter mark must be seen in the same way. And I hesitate with the next one. I argue that we need national government policies whereby the government must actually have policies which apply to all higher education institutions in addressing issues of race and social justice. But with this government, and indeed, I don't think if we have a new government next year, that this will actually happen. But that's another story, right? And finally, higher education institutions must acknowledge and address institutional racism and white privilege. How does this impact in higher education? How does it impact on staff? How does it impact on students? Why is this important? It's important because a failure to acknowledge racism results in a failure to act upon it. Thank you very much. And that is my book, which has everything that I've just talked about, available in all good bookshops. Thank you so much. So we have over to you, Aina.
Yes, thank you very much, Kalwant. Fantastic keynote, as expected. So we would like to open the floor to the audience, the students, the colleagues, for questions, reactions, comments. I need to organize my view now, but maybe, Laia, you can distribute les paraules? What do you think? There is someone raising their hand. Just 1 second. No, I can't see everybody.
Yeah, feel free to raise your hand and I know.
Now I can see all the screen with all the names, and there is also former students, which is a pleasure to see them here.
Yeah, so let's start by Sebastian.
So yeah, I can see Sebastian. Maybe let's see if we can group 2 or 3 questions, and if not, we can start with Sebastian. Yeah, let's do that. Let's start with Sebastian. Gracias, Sebastian. And make time for other people also to organize their thinking. So, Sebastian.
Yes, well, gracias, and thank you so much again for delivering this keynote. I thought it was widely interesting, and yeah, as a topic that I'm also very interested about, I was just curious to hear your thoughts, because to me it seems like a lot of the problems that kind of causes institutional racism also come from like perceptions of race in broader British society more broadly. And yeah, I don't know, in the summer I was just doing some reading, and I don't know if you know, but there's a writer called Akala. He wrote a book on the ruins of class and empire. Yeah, okay. So I see you appreciate it, but in it he also kind of spoke about the emotional experiences he had kind of as a mixed race child, you know, being treated in school differently by teachers and stuff. And yeah, I was just wondering if you had any like broader thoughts about whether you think that it's possible to simply challenge this institution of whiteness at the level of academia, or whether you think it needs to be addressed at a broader societal level, and if so, if you have any thoughts about any possible steps that could be taken to address this, because clearly to me it seems like it comes from the perceptions of like white people and people who have the privileges of whiteness kind of having these perceptions. And well, yeah, that's from my point of view. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. That's a really important and interesting question. And I think that you're absolutely right in terms of understanding how racism is perceived. As a society in the UK, race is, it kind of has these different turns in terms of how it's seen. And as I said in my talk, it's often dependent upon the government that we have in power, and it's often dependent upon a historical moment in terms of how it's addressed. So there's this tension and this disconnect, and that shifts and has shifted and changed throughout history, in my opinion. And so what we've had is our history is one of imperialism, colonialism, oppression, and slavery, which is not spoken about. And when it is spoken about, what happens, and I talk about this in my work, when you voice racism and you talk about racism, you become, as a victim of racism, you become a villain. The victims become a villain because you're not allowed to talk about racism because it's something that's silent and hidden. But as I've said, we see it in the media, we see it in our sport, we see it in education. So you're absolutely right. It has to be addressed from a much more broader, holistic level. It's not just in higher education, right? It exists everywhere. And as a mother of mixed race children who are half white and half Indian, they experience huge amounts of racism every day, as I do every day of my life. And I think mixed heritage kids, in some ways, and the research shows that they get it worse because they don't belong to either culture. They're not allowed to belong. And I think Carla talks about this in his book, doesn't he? About the lack of belonging. So you're not really white. You're never going to be accepted as white because it's the 1 drop rule. You've got a bit of mixedness in you and you're never accepted by the other side, and so on and so forth. And so what happens is that we have this brushing over of identities, mixedness around race, which is really dangerous, actually. And I think it's something that needs to be thought about even more. And the second part of your question in terms of how to address it is really difficult. So I think the way it needs to be addressed is, as I said in my talk, we need to step back. We need to go back to primary school level, when kids start school, to think about what they're being taught and the types of histories that they're being taught. So the history that kids are taught in the UK is all white history, okay? We need to think and change the way the curriculum is taught. So it's very white-centric, it's very Eurocentric, so that white kids and mixed heritage kids and brown and black kids grow up with understanding the history of the UK in oppression, imperialism and colonialism, and the contribution that my parents and other parents made to this country in making it what it is. And I think we don't do that. So by the time students come to us in higher education, it's almost too late, which is what I said in my talk. So I hope I've answered your question, but a really, really important question. Thank you very much for that.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fantastic question answer. Is there any other hand raised? I can see Ipsita. Hello, Ipsita. Mauro, maybe I have seen your hand, like, not with the machine. So let's do Ipsita. Maybe I wonder if you can open your camera. If this is not possible, no problem, but for the interaction is better. Hello, she was a student of us past year. So let's do together, if you agree, Ipsita and Mauro Moschetti. Mauro is a colleague from our research group and will be also a lecturer in GLOVET this year. Or maybe I can see Mauro now. If you agree, let's do these 3 questions together. Ipsita, Mauro Moschetti, and Mauro Harkin, and then maybe another round. But Ipsita.
Hi, thank you, Professor Bhopal. It was a really good like starting point to kind of just discuss how how can we make academic spaces more inclusive.
Sorry, I don't know if it's me, but if you can speak a little bit slower, because somehow the voice is being lost.
Maybe it's the earphones. Is it better?
I think so.
Okay, all right. Yeah, no, I just have like, it's not like really a question, but more like a way to like sort of navigate, because like university spaces are grounds of like colonial practices, and like it's always like we're always, especially in the UK, I feel like a lot of I studied at Sussex at the Institute of Development Studies. I did my master's there. So it's just like really difficult to kind of create these sort of collaborative spaces to where we can have like, discussions of like decolonial approaches or something. So like, how do we start? Like, how do we start in terms of like, how can we make the curriculum or like just our daily interaction in a way that can be less like Eurocentric? I don't know. Or like, how do we kind of step back from like reproduction of colonial processes that we sort of engage with like as like students of color, or yeah, just like out of curiosity. I don't know if there's like a straight answer to it, but I'm just curious to know. Thank you.
Kalwant, do you agree if we join these 3 voices? Super.
Yeah.
So Mario Moschetti, who is professor for TEPS and GLOVET.
Hi, Kalwant, and thank you very much for this lecture. You mentioned that the quotas in the UK were illegal, and I was wondering whether in your research in the US you were able to gather some data regarding this idea that quotas may backfire, or whether they, I imagine there should be some discussion around that. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. And Mauro Harkin, student from this year.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I just have a brief question. From a social movement perspective, how can we make a difference regarding woke positions when struggling against racism in education? I mean, if a victim or if the victim is the woke subject or the classical woke subject, who could be the alternative? What kind of collective subject can we create in schools, in universities, to fight for more rights and stuff? Thank you.
you can answer, Kalwant, or react.
Thank you. Well, wow, fantastic questions again. What a fantastic audience you have, Aina, for me. Brilliant questions. So in terms of the first question, Ipshita, I think it was, I think it's really important in terms of change and the way that we approach change. So from my experience, when we try to make changes in terms of challenging imperialism and colonialism and the Eurocentric curriculum, there's always resistance, okay? And that's my experience. And, you know, I'm old enough to remember what it was like 30 years ago. And the reason why this happens, and I talk about this in my book, is because white groups feel as though their white privilege is threatened, and they're not about to give that up to brown people or black people. So I think at the very least, the way that we can start thinking about that is having, and it's really basic, right? It's having basic conversations, opening up those conversations, because mentioning our word, racism, and mentioning white privilege, people find it really difficult to talk about these things. So I think at the very least, we have to start opening those conversations. That's the first thing. And the second thing is we must challenge the imperialist, colonialist ways in which the discourses and narratives have worked in universities. And one of the ways that we can try to do this is through, I mean, whatever it means, decolonizing the curriculum. And there have been attempts in the UK to do that, some very good and some not so good. So I think that is an attempt to understand it. That's the second thing. And the third thing is, I don't think it's the responsibility of Black and brown people to do it on their own. It is a holistic responsibility. So in my research, I find that race equality initiatives, it's always up to me to do it. It's always up to the brown person or the Black person, because it's about you. It's not about us. So I think we need to break that disconnect. It's about everyone, right? And it's everyone's responsibility to further social justice. It's everyone's responsibility to address racism. Because if it continues to be divided, then what will happen is white privilege just flourishes. So that's the first question. And the second question, again, a really, really excellent question. And yes, was it Mourinho that asked the question? Absolutely. What happened in terms of quotas was really interesting. The people that I spoke to, they said that their white colleagues said to them, you're only here because of the quota. You're not really that good, okay? Your work isn't really that good. The only reason that you got hired is because this university wanted to fill the quota. So the danger with having a target system or a quota system is immediately people think you're lowering standards. It isn't about that. It's about having the representation. And in the UK, excuse me, we have the Equality Act. And within the Equality Act, there's a clause which says that if you are interviewing someone who is from a BME background and somebody who is white, and they are the same, you have to employ the BME person. But I've sat on many, many interview panels. In reality, that never happens, because interview panels always find an excuse to why the white person is better. Okay, so yes, you know, people are told. And just as an aside, we just published a book. Sorry, we just published a book on elites, and we found that when students of color attend elite universities, they are told by their peers, you're only here as a quota. The university only employed you because they wanted to tick that box. So it works for students as well. You're not rude. So I think that you're absolutely, I'm assuming that that was the subtext of your question. So the quota systems can backfire and have. And then the last question, sorry, was about social movements and how can we find alternative collective to move these issues forward. So I really think student voice.
We are kind of losing you, Kalwant. In fact, I don't see you anymore. She's not here, right?
Oh,
here, Kalwant, we lost you.
I got cut off. I'm really sorry.
Okay, no problem at all.
I'm back. So what I was saying was, in terms of the third question, which was again a really good question, is that I think that student voice is hugely important in terms of activism and moving this forward. And I think that obviously it isn't just the responsibility of students, it's everybody's responsibility to think about how we can take these issues forward. But I think in terms of social movements and progress, I think we do have to mobilize together as one single community to take these issues forward. And student voice is really important. It's important because students pay £9,250 UK pounds as undergraduates to study at universities, and double that if they're doing a master's. So if students protest, vice chancellors and presidents will listen to them, because it is, I do feel that the marketization and neoliberal higher education system that we're in has become a capitalist enterprise, and it is all about money, unfortunately. So what happens is vice chancellors will listen to students. So I hope I answered those three questions okay.
Excellent. Can we do last round, maybe? So let me check the different screens. I would like to add a question myself, but maybe there is other people. I see. Oh, okay, yeah. Sophie, Carla, and Capres. This is what I can see in the screen. So let's do that. Sophie, Carla, and Capres. If this is not so much, I will add something, and if not, no problem. Carla, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. It was super interesting. So when I was hearing your talk, I was thinking about a Spanish case with the Gypsy community, indeed. And I was thinking that sometimes we also forget them when we talk about racism and prejudice here in Spain. And I just wanted to know if you can give me more information about this case. Maybe you know something about how to also deal with the white, with the white, the white like identity, and also like the gypsy thing here in Spain. But yeah, basically because I think that sometimes they also get like the worst educational outcomes in our institutions here in Spain. And maybe you know something about the case. But thank you so much.
Sophie?
Thank you. Well, I was actually considering to apply for a master's at a British university. And then while starting the process, I saw that there was this drop down where you had to choose your ethnicity while applying to that university, which I was quite shocked about because I hadn't seen that at any other university before. But I think it's like quite common when you apply for universities in the UK. So I was wondering whether you know why that is and what you think about that, because probably studies like yours are also kind of based on these statistics, right? Because you've used statistics about like ethnicities at the university, so probably use those numbers. So I guess it's useful for research, but I guess there's like a lot of sides to that.
Okay, let's do something. Capres, is this your name?
Yes, yeah.
Super.
Hi.
So, Kalwant, if you agree, I've said one round, but let's do two, because there is a lot of people who want to interact with you. So, if I'm not wrong, now it's Carla, Sophie, Capres, and then we will do Dua, Aurora, and Taufik. Sorry if I pronounce badly some of the names, and this will be the end, kind of, okay? I can ask you my questions on another occasion. So, Capres.
Hello, and thank you also for the talk. So I went to university, I grew up in the UK, and I went to university at Goldsmiths in London. And so these issues were discussed quite a lot through my studies. And I wanted to just comment that I'm glad you mentioned about the importance of the differences within the BME or BAME title. And this is because the stereotypes that are attached to the different ethnic groups tend to be different. And so, for example, Black students' stereotypes tend to be around laziness, unintelligence, what else? But then really good at sport, athletically gifted. Thieves with the 70s discourse that the media was pumping out. But then in comparison to maybe their South Asian counterparts, they have stereotypes such as really good at maths. Their families are doctors, scientists, nurses, dentists, and therefore the expectations of them performing in education tend to be quite different, despite still obviously having also negative stereotypes attached. So I think it's really important to highlight, because then when we're able to break down or when we look at breaking down the BME title, we can then start to discuss how to address the different disparities within education and the performance and the access that these different groups have. I hope this is making sense.
Yes.
It's a really important issue, yeah. And on that as well, about the whole quota and target thing within maybe hiring or having students or people coming into education. People entering the workforce. Another issue is that then feeds over into that. So that's why we tend to see such a low level of Black women, especially Black Muslim women, to be unfortunately the most disadvantaged, to be accessing these spaces, maybe getting hired for a job in comparison to maybe, another BME counterpart. I previously worked in the civil service, and actually it was really interesting that in my whole department of around 800 people, there were about 3 Black people in the whole department, but then there were maybe, I would say, around 150 other racial ethnic groups. And so I think, yeah, this really talks to your presentation and your research. And yeah, so I thought I'd just mention that. Thank you.
So Kalwant, maybe I think you can react to these 3 and then the last round, okay?
Yeah. Again, fantastic. Thank you, Carla, Sophie, and Capres for your fantastic questions. Really important questions again. So in terms of the GRT community, I don't know much about the situation in Spain, but I'm guessing it's very similar to where it is in other parts of Europe, as it is in the UK. So what we have in the UK is the white working class discourse narrative debate, where basically everybody thinks it's the white working class that are the most disadvantaged in educational outcomes. And when you actually look at the statistics, this is not the case. The most disadvantaged, first of all, are Gypsy, Roma and Traveller students, who experience worse levels of racism and the worst educational outcomes at every single level of their educational experience. And then you have Pakistani, Bangladeshi students, and then you have Black students. Although the white working class, it depends how you obviously define class, which is problematic anyway. So what you've said there is hugely important, and I think that I have written about Gypsy, Roma and Traveller groups, and I can send you those references. But what quite happens is that the GRT groups, they get put in with the white category, and that's wrong, because their experiences are very, very different to white groups. And as I said, that despite themselves identifying as white, and in our research they did identify as white, they do not have those same privileges afforded to white middle class or working class privilege, because of the fact that they come from a GRT background. And the second one about ethnicity statistics, again, a really important question. And I think that being somebody who is critical, and I urge you all, don't accept anything at face value as students. And I say this to my PhD students: question everything. That's your role as a student. And one of the things that's really important about the ethnicity stats is I'm quite dubious in terms of how those statistics are being used. So the university says that those statistics are being used so that they can actually monitor how many students they have in their university and how they can support them. But one would argue that they could be used in a different way, particularly in relation to encouraging who they want to come to their universities. And I think that it also depends on geographical location. So, for example, the University of Birmingham, I would argue, is quite diverse compared to, say, for example, the University of Southampton, which is very, very white, privately educated. But then you also have to look at the elite universities, and you see that Oxford, Cambridge, and UCL, and well, UCL has a lot of international students, is predominantly white. So I think that those statistics, we should question them. And the final comment about stereotypes around BAME students is, yes, of course, that's a fantastic comment, because it's true. And in my research, when I interviewed students from BAME backgrounds, what I found was that Black male students were stereotyped as being aggressive, female Muslim students were stereotyped as being passive, and Asian students, and white middle class students were seen as the model student, and they would do well. And the ways in which these stereotypes work, and you're absolutely right, Caprice, is they go on to the labour market. And that's why the statistics on the labour market show that, and there's lots of research to show this, particularly in names. If you send your CV and your name isn't Joe Bloggs or Jane Bloggs, you will not get an interview. So that racism exists at different levels. It starts, I would argue, it starts in schools, it goes on to higher education, and then works on into the labour market. So we have horizontal and vertical segregation and racism, which exists within the labour market.
Thank you very much. So Kalwant, if you give us 5 more minutes of your time, we would like to add this last round. Dua, Aurora, Taufik, you can follow one each other. I don't need to open again the micro, okay? So the floor is yours, Dua.
Okay, so thank you so much for such an enlightening and reflective session. I have an inquisitive, or you may say a curious impression that isn't it irony that we are using university, diversity, and these type of words, though they behold oxymoronic structures and impressions in my mind. For example, Sophie's, I want to second the Sophie's comment that yes, university promotes that we should inhibit the racism, yet at the same hand, it is somehow with the policies or the practices itself is practicing the racism. For example, let me give the example, the financial aids, or for example, the certain support providing to certain community and confined to certain type of ethnicity. Isn't it itself a racism by the university? So how could we expect the same institution to create a ripple effect in the society overall?
Aurora, Matsu?
Yeah, I want to thank you for the lecture. And I really connected with a thing that you said that is, so I'm having like sort of reflections and maybe some questions regarding how identity politics can become a double-edged sword. I find that very, very personal with the struggle of doing research that wants to target a global audience, but then I have to engage with this sort of Olympics of suffering just to make myself or my story or the relevance of the topics that I want to research interesting to a global audience and to finance. So how do you, I don't know, navigate that? And also the language of the academy and English as a form of oppression that I find very, it's like a way to open gates, English to speak like we're talking right now, but it's also a way of oppressing, and the language of academic work that really restricts the way we can express ourselves and the traditions of our own language and how we speak and how we think, and is translated to this other language and this sort of conventions of writing that it can be very, very oppressive. So I wanted to think what you thought about that.
Taufik?
Hola a todos. Thank you for this rich presentation and insightful presentation. Just out of curiosity, I want to ask you like 2 questions. Over the summer, I have been studying cases of institutional inequality in educational system, both in South Africa. In his book, Trevor Noah, Born a Crime, he addressed this issue of institutional racism in educational system. So I realized that the root or the stem of the problem comes down to the primary education curriculum. So how, in your opinion, can we address that and then therefore prevent these cases of institutional inequality in our educational system? And also in Morocco, we have the same problem with the French community. And if you've been to a French school, then it means you're privileged and you have more chances to access higher education. Thank you so much.
Excellent. So Kalwant, if you want to react.
Yeah, again, thank you so much for fantastic, really interesting questions. So in terms of Jua's question, I think what's really important in terms of understanding how we can overcome what you called a ripple effect in terms of policies and practices and how they work within universities is that what universities do is, I argue, that we have this performative element. So what universities do is they perform equality, they perform social justice, and they perform inclusion. And what happens is that performance is for a tick box exercise, and it's for the university to sell itself as diverse and fair, to sell itself so students will come to that university. And I argue that in effect, what happens is that nothing really changes. So if you look at the numbers of black and brown professors that there are in universities, they remain low. If you look at the numbers of recorded instances of racism, they are not addressed. So what we need to do is we need to look at the policies, but we also need to look at the practices and how those are actually borne out. And I think that that's not happening at the moment. And that's why I think that we have to think about the holistic perspective and the whole community in terms of we can take that forward. And in terms of Aurora's question around identity politics and English as a form of oppression, I think that your question is a really, really important one, because I think that what happens again is that we have this hierarchy of what I call a hierarchy of oppression. And so what happens within that is that identity politics becomes a competition. So my oppression is more important than yours because of the fact that it's important to me. So what we have to do, and I hope I've outlined this in my talk, is that we have to really have to talk about intersectional experiences. But in my work, I do show how gender has always been given precedence over race within higher education policy making in the UK. I don't know the situation it'd be interesting actually to see the situation in Spain and whether it's the same. But white women have been the main beneficiaries of policy making. And that in itself is also reflected in the student experience, because white students have been the main beneficiaries of their experiences in university, because they're more likely to leave university with a 2-1 or a first, etc. And in terms of your point about language, I think you're absolutely right. You know, the English language is used as a form of white privilege and as a form of oppression. And it's I would go back to tacit intentionality. That is all intentional, and it's no accident that English is considered the most important language in the world, and that is used as a form of oppression, and it stems back from acts of violence against people of colour, slavery, and indeed imperialism and colonialism, especially in the UK. And your question, the final question, is how can we actually address, you talked about how we can address this in terms of looking at the primary level and the fact that when we get to higher education, it's almost too late. Well, I think that, I hope I said it in my talk, that we have to step back and we have to talk about and look at, firstly, our curriculums at primary and secondary school levels. And we also have to look at the demographics of teachers. who is teaching these children? So in the UK, the school demographics, teachers are more likely to be white and female. Okay, so kids do not have brown or black role models in terms of who is teaching them. And secondly, the curriculum is ethnocentric. It's a white-centric curriculum where young children are not taught about imperialism and colonialism and the contribution that black and brown people made to the UK. And I think if it starts at that level and then it continues on, by the time students come to us in HE, they will be better informed to understand these processes of colonialism and imperialism. And I think your point about French schools is really interesting, because I think that that's the same in other countries. So it's not unique in that sense. So once privileged, always privileged. So if you go to a French school, you're more like, I bet the statistics show that you're more likely to have better outcomes, educational outcomes, and better entry into higher level earning within the labour market. So I hope I've answered those 3 questions okay.
Fantastic, Kalwant. Thank you very much. So I think we can say the master is already inaugurated for this 8th cohort. Thank you very much to all of you for being here, for your questions, for your engagement. As Kalwant said, all the questions were very, very interesting. So thank you one more time. I give the floor to Tony and Laia. And with the new cohort, see you in the classroom next week. Thank you very much.
Yeah, only to say that we have really enjoyed your presentation, Professor Bhopal, and I really look forward to meeting this new cohort of students next week in the classroom.
Can I just say that I think Patricia has a question? She had a hand up. Somebody, yes. Let's just put it in the chat.
Oh, okay. Fantastic. Yeah, I cannot in the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, so I grew up, born and raised in Kenya, and I afterwards went to the US and I studied my undergraduate there. And I did not have a chance to really question my identity until I was in, a group that these conversations were encouraged and so on and so forth. And so what I witnessed was student organizations that were put together to encourage conversations like this to happen were usually very vibrant. The incentive was there to bring up these conversations and to talk about it and to have conversations about this. But what happened on a larger scale is that now what I witnessed with my friends and other people I knew is that it was a bit difficult for us to have these conversations. And my question to you was, how do we make it so that these conversations are had in a way that is beneficial to people of color and people who can participate in raising awareness and fostering these conversations? And how can that be bridged so that it's not like, okay, there's an organization of people who really want to have this conversation, but there's another group that really feels they do not have a stake in the conversation, or they cannot contribute to the conversation. And how can those two be put together so that we can move forward? And yeah, that was my question.
Super. Thank you, Patricia. I haven't seen the chat, in fact, so I'm so sorry. Happy you could add your question. I was also suffering because I know that Professor Bhopal had to end at some time. So also thank you, Kalwant, for adding this new question.
Yeah, apologize for interrupting.
No. Go.
Thank you for your question, Patricia. I think that's a really good question. What I think is it's really important in terms of how you approach these issues. So the first thing that I would say, that when we talk about issues of race and racial injustice and social justice, it's important to know that it benefits everyone, okay? It's not just for Black and brown or minority ethnic marginalized communities. And that's one of the things that I talk about in my work, that it's beneficial to the whole list. It's a holistic approach. So it benefits the whole of the university, right? It benefits staff, it benefits students, it benefits people who work in the local area, those links with businesses. So it's beneficial to everyone. It's not just for one group. So I think it's important not to compartmentalize it. However, but we do need safe spaces for people from marginalized communities to talk about issues of racism and exclusion and marginalization. And those spaces, safe spaces, should only exist for those individuals who want to be there. However, what we need to do is we also need to have spaces where everyone comes together to talk about these issues in a safe environment. So my answer to your question is, it's beneficial for the whole community, and it's important to have those safe spaces, but also to integrate those in other venues where individuals can come together to discuss it. Because, you know, when you talk about racism, and as I've said, you know, EDI and social justice policies always fall on the burdens of Black and brown people. Okay, it's not our responsibility to change it, it's everyone's responsibility. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, fantastic answer indeed. I think this is a brilliant way to properly conclude. I think there is no one else. So yeah, now we can conclude. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much, Kalwant. Again, Tony, Laia, if you want to add something. So see you next week in the class, and yeah, hoping to learn together and to be with you in this Globet journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and good luck, students, for your journeys. Enjoy, and I look forward to hearing more. And thank you so much. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Our absolute pleasure, Kalwant.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.